Superintendent of Public Instruction Kruse made an appearance on Fox 13 News yesterday that I just have to play some clips from. So he sat down with my friend Hannah Kim, and I think Hannah does a pretty good job. But you know, Kruse, I think Reichdahl has mastered better than anyone the art of word soup. Like, this guy, better than anyone, can say a bunch of words that don't mean anything that sound good. It's insane. I mean, it's actually pretty annoying, but you'll see it here. But I think he gets away with it, unfortunately. And he does this thing that I call talk you out of time, where you know you have like 10 minutes to interview him, because I've interviewed him before. Jay Inslee was very good at this. And it's like, okay, I got 10 minutes, so I know she's going to want to ask hard questions. So I'll spend like 5 minutes just blah, 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 with not a breath in the middle answering so that she can get fewer questions in. So I was glad to see that Hannah Kim asked him about the issue of trans athletes and, you know, what he would say to concerns that, very obvious concerns, that it's not fair for boys to play against girls. Here's a clip.
Some of those families with, young female athletes would say that this is an equity issue, that it's not in the same playing field. So what is your response to those families?
Well, first and foremost, my job is to follow the law. So regardless of what I personally feel, which is an inclusive perspective, we should all follow the law. The federal laws allow us to build a state law on top of it. In other words, Title IX of the federal law said, hey, we need equal access to females. This was created decades ago. But then it said, states, you get to build some civil rights above that. And states like ours in California, Massachusetts, states all across the country said when it comes to gender, it's about identity, not necessarily sex at birth.
Okay, first of all, you didn't answer the question. She's asking you what you would say to families and to young women who don't think it's fair, and you're not willing to actually answer that on the merits because you don't have a good answer for it. But he goes into this thing about it's about following the law, and in Washington state, this is the law. Right, but who passed the law? Democrats. What are you, a Democrat? If you wanted to, you could advocate for the law to be changed. The law can easily be changed. But you don't want to change the law. So he couches it all in, I'm just following the law, which is arguable considering that President Donald Trump has said that, and I get it, that this is going to be figured out in the courts, but certainly it's not federal law. But you're following this little weird state law you've crafted where you say boys can compete against girls and share girls' spaces, which is just odd. But again, not answering the question and also couching it in, this is about following the law when you can help change the law. So that's the question. It's like, okay, you're following the law, but what would you say to parents who want you to change the law, who think it's time to change the law in Washington state? Let's keep listening.
So I always try to put this in perspective for people. There's 5 to 10 athletes out of 1 million students in our state, right, who are participating as transgender athletes. Maybe they were born intersex, maybe they went through transition.
Intersex thing.
So our message is we can do this. We've been doing this for 20 years without controversy until Donald Trump, where we accommodate the individual as best we can.
When you say intersex, what do you mean by that?
They are not born with biological male or female private parts. That is a small fraction of the U.S. population, but it's a very real biological thing. So when people run around and say, you're either a boy or a girl, there's actually a fraction of our population that isn't born one way or the other. And so we need to accommodate. That's just one category of transgender, of course, but I'm always trying to help people understand that nothing is black and white. It's always a little more complicated.
It's not. You're a boy or you're a girl. We're not talking about intersex people. And there's no evidence that any of those transgender athletes you mentioned are intersex. I've seen no sort of assertions of that whatsoever. You're talking about this absolute anomaly, really, in the human genome. And so he goes to that because it makes it almost more justifiable, but it is black and white. You're a dude or you're a chick, period. You were born a dude or you were born a chick. And yes, there are a few genetic anomalies, and that's not what we're talking about here. But he totally makes a point for us that I think is important to listen to. Can you play back just that little clip?
There's 5 to 10 athletes out of 1 million students in our state, right, who are participating as transgender athletes.
5? Okay. I have no way of fact checking that because, of course, student information is private. He says there's 5 to 10 transgender students participating in athletics out of a million in the entire state of Washington. So let's throw them a bone and just cut it down the middle. So let's say there's 8, right? Don't you think it's odd, Kruse Reichdahl, that 20% of them are state champions? Let's say it's 8. We know for sure that 2 of them are state champions. The one that won the meet in Kashmir, Washington, the Junior Olympics track meet, and then the one that just won, Nicole, do you have this? The one that just won the state title in the 400. So the natural question for Kruse Reykdal would be, hey, okay, let's say that's true. Let's just cut it down the middle. You say 5 to 10. Let's call it 8. Well, that would be 25%. Why are 25% of them so good that they're state champions? And of course, the answer to that is because they have a biological advantage. That's an extraordinary statistical anomaly, right? You have this tiny subset, 5 to 10 out of a million. But amongst those 5 to 10, 25% are the best in the sport that they compete in. Why? Because they're men, they're boys, and they have a biological advantage. And I just wish I could get Kruse Reykdal in front of us again to drill him down on that point. Do you or do you not believe that men have a biological advantage to women? Of course they do. And if he says no, okay, well then why are 25% of them state champions? Because that's like a statistical impossibility if they have the same physical abilities, right? The same athleticism. But of course, he'll never do an interview with us again, which is kind of a bummer. It's a crazy thing, and it's something that the media doesn't ask enough about. I am glad that Hannah at least broached the topic with him, because for whatever reason, mainstream media, they don't want to talk about trans issues unless it's like supporting trans people, right? They don't want to question radical gender ideology. They don't want to expose some of the radical gender lessons that are happening in schools. They don't want to talk about, because they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, because they don't want to get the level of criticism that we get for talking about it. And I mean, Hannah couched her question with a lot of, it was like a 1-minute question. Oh, a lot of parents will agree with you and all this stuff, almost trying to protect herself from any blowback for just asking what is a really, really legitimate question. But someone needs to, who is capable of getting in front of Kruse Reykdal, because he'll never talk to us again, just simply ask him that. Why are 25% of them state champions? And it could be higher than that. It could be higher than that. I just don't know who the other trans athletes are. All we know are the ones who are exposed and put on the news, and parents take pictures of them or whatever it is. Because, I mean, I can look at someone and tell you if it's a boy or a girl, but contrary to popular belief, I'm not watching high school athletics during my free time. So speaking of that, the Supreme Court out with a huge ruling for those of us who are trying to push back against radical gender ideology. I think this is a big thing, because the most serious issue is the medicalization of children. Like, this athletic thing is bad. It just speaks to the craziness that has consumed the left. Boys and women's spaces and girls' locker rooms and stuff, that's bad. But it's the medicalization of children, removing healthy breasts or healthy testicles or whatever it is, because they've been convinced by a friend or a teacher or a parent even that they were born in the wrong body. So now we're going to, make medical changes to them that will impact them the rest of their lives. And we've platformed detransitioners. That's something I'd like to see the mainstream media do. Platform some detransitioners. We've had some on recently who've talked about the lifelong consequences of being medicalized as teenagers. Not in the state of Tennessee. Supreme Court okays Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for kids, a setback for transgender rights. Okay, you can characterize it that way. It says, they called it a jolting setback to transgender rights. The justice's 6-3 decision in a case from Tennessee effectively protects from legal challenges many efforts by President Donald Trump's Republican administration and state governments to roll back protections for transgender people. Another 26 states have laws similar to Tennessee. So you've got about half the states in the nation who ban gender-affirming care, and they call it that. It's butchery. You have states that ban butchery for children. You're an adult, do what you want as an adult. So half the country is sane on this. Washington is not one of those states. We allow the butchery of children in the name of radical gender ideology. And so far, some of that has continued despite President Donald Trump's threats to remove funding from places like Seattle Children's Hospital, etc. So just a few moments ago, Governor Bob Ferguson came out with a response to the SCOTUS ruling. He says, as long as I'm governor, I will stand up for the civil rights of transgender Washingtonians. We're not talking about civil rights. It's not a civil right for a 14-year-old to get their breasts cut off because they think it'll make them a boy. Good God. As long as I'm governor, I'll stand up for the civil rights of transgender Washingtonians. I know that many are deeply saddened and angered by today's Supreme Court ruling. I am with you. But today's ruling does not change Washington's laws or the civil rights protections that we've adopted. I will fight for those protections. Again, I will continue to underscore the disgusting nature of adults supporting the butchery of children. And in the case of Kruse, a grown man sitting there advocating for boys to beat girls in sports, for boys to take opportunities away from girls, for boys to be in girls' spaces like locker rooms. Think of how sick that is, like a grown man trying to put men into women's spaces. It's crazy stuff. So I hope that the Trump administration, because of this Supreme Court ruling, will be even more emboldened to continue to put pressure on states like Washington to stop this disgusting practice. I have heard some headlines out of California recently that there are some individual hospitals. One particular gender clinic, I think it was in San Francisco, ended up just shutting down its wing that provided surgical interventions for minors. So look, Europe is already ahead of us on this. A lot of countries have already banned this sort of stuff. I think give it 1 to 5 years and we'll look back at this as very Kevorkian stuff and just absolutely insane. But we will always remember the people who pushed for it. We will always remember the politicians who pushed for the mutilation of children in the name of radical gender ideology. And I've never said that if you're a teen and you want to dress like a boy and present like a boy and that's your thing, that doesn't impact my life. I think that's probably bad parenting, but Lord knows when we were in high school, everyone was goth or you had, girls who were tomboys or whatever it is. If you want to present more masculine or more feminine, but at the point when you start mandating that people call you by different pronouns, that you hide secrets about your gender identity from parents, and the state mandates that that's done, that everything is kept from you, that you're connected to gender hormones that stop you from having puberty through our public school system, which all of our tax money goes to. And then our tax money is funding institutions that carry out irreversible procedures on kids that many of them go on to regret later in life. I'm going to have a problem with that. It's the right thing to stand up and push back against that.